The graviton strength chamber didn't feel like a training hall. It felt like a place that remembered every failure that had ever occurred inside it. The walls were dented in shapes no one could identify. The air carried a faint metallic tang as if it had been squeezed too hard, and the floor plates thrummed with a low vibration that didn't match any machine rhythm. It sounded more like a warning. Every cadet entering the room instinctively adjusted their posture, the same way creatures stand taller when they sense a predator nearby. Nothing in the chamber was alive, but it gave the unsettling impression that it was waiting to see who would break first. The instructor keyed in the activation sequence, and columns of mass blocks rose from recessed wells in the floor, glowing faintly from internal stabilization fields. These were not ordinary weights. They were forged from ultra-dense alloys meant for mech calibration, each block heavy enough to fracture armor if dropped. The alien cadets lined up, their expressions a mixture of determination and silent regret. A Threxian rolled his shoulders, exoskeletal plates clicking in place. A Virelian rubbed his temples to stimulate his telekinetic nodes. The Solarian twins argued quietly about grip angles, their voices clicking like ceramic shards. "Same rule as always," the instructor announced. "Lift what you can. We record your limit. No posturing, no theatrics, just your maximum." The walls flickered with the silhouettes of past record holders, Threxians mostly, the occasional Luroven. Not a single human. There were too few of them at the academy to fill even a single row in the archives. Those who did show up usually kept their heads down and tried to avoid becoming examples. The test began. The Threxian stepped forward first. He stood tall, even by his species standards. Heavily plated joints and muscle bands under armor made him look like a walking engine block. He chose a grav block weighing just under 700 kilograms and positioned himself with careful precision. Bent knees, wide stance, elbows locked. The platform recognized him, dimmed the stabilization field slightly, and beeped as his grasp settled. He grunted, low and guttural, pulling with segmented strength. The block rose just enough to register the load, then dropped with a hiss of discharged tension. The Threxian stepped back, chest heaving, sweat dripping under his hardened chin. Threxian limit recorded, 708 kilograms. Applause rippled through the cadets. The Threxian nodded, one hand on his lower back, and limped to the rest station. Next came a Solarian, tall, agile, with 4 arms that moved independently. She approached with the confidence of someone who had already visualized her victory. She lifted a 620-kilogram block using all 4 limbs in a synchronized grip. The block lifted briefly, but then her lower right wrist slipped, the angle tilted, and a sharp pop echoed across the chamber. She dropped the weight with a yelp, clutching her arm. The instructor stepped in immediately. "Disengage. Confirm injury." A med drone zoomed in and scanned. "Partial radial dislocation. No fracture. Recommend sling immobilization for 48 hours. The Solarian clenched her teeth. "I thought I had it." "You didn't need to win," the instructor said. "You only needed to know your limit." The Virelian followed. Unlike the others, it didn't use physical strength. Its body was slender, almost fragile, adapted for low-gravity environments. It sat cross-legged in front of a levitating block and focused. Its skin flushed darker violet as it projected a narrow telekinetic field around the object. The block twitched, floated, and hovered for 6 seconds before blood streamed from the Virelian's nose. "Abort," the instructor said again. The block dropped. The Virelian collapsed to one side, hands trembling. 2 drones moved to stabilize it. "Microvascular breach detected," one said. "Cerebral perfusion abnormal. Recommend immediate cranial rest and neural flush therapy." The instructor's face remained unreadable. Virelian limit recorded, 491 kilograms, mental strain detected. The test continued. Some cadets impressed. Most failed quietly, a few injured themselves, even after being warned. When it was finally over, the room felt heavier than the blocks. Then the human arrived. He walked in without rush or worry, carrying nothing but a half-finished bottle of water and the relaxed posture of someone who had wandered in by accident. His eyes drifted across the near-crushed walls, the flickering stabilization fields, the sweat-beaded aliens. None of it seemed to surprise him. If anything, He looked mildly curious, as though the room's dangerous reputation was news he was willing to consider, but not yet convinced by. He wore the standard cadet uniform with sleeves rolled up, one forearm still faintly bruised from last week's reflex training. No armor, no special padding. Just a bandage on his right hand and a pale scar that ran diagonally across his collarbone. The instructor gestured to the platform. "You're last. Step up when ready." The human, whose record listed him as Staff Cadet Daniel Hayes, nodded. He took 2 steps forward, then stopped. He looked over the array of mass blocks. Then, at the aliens recovering on stretchers or sipping electrolyte fluids, he furrowed his brow. He pointed toward the equipment and asked, with a tone of genuine confusion, "Before I start, do you mean their limit or mine?" The room fell silent. The Solarian twins stopped their whispering. The Varelian opened one eye. The instructor frowned. "What exactly are you asking?" Hayes shrugged. "Just need to know which limit you want measured. You said, lift what you can. But do you mean as in, what I can carry? Or what they could carry if they were me?" The instructor blinked slowly. "Your own limit?" Hayes nodded, relieved. "Good. I was worried I'd hurt the comparison." There were no smiles, no laughter. The cadets were watching him differently now. The instructor tapped his console. "Load Threxian maximum." The 708-kilogram block rose and stabilized on the platform. It still bore the faint indentation from the Threxian's earlier grip. Hayes stepped forward, exhaled gently through his nose, and gripped the sides of the block. He lifted it like a box of empty cartons. No bounce, no misstep. He held it for 2 full seconds, then returned it gently to the ground. A ripple spread through the cadets. The Threxian leaned forward, muttering something to the Solarian in disbelief. The instructor said nothing. He tapped again. Solarian maximum. A 620-kilogram dual-axle block appeared. Hayes raised one eyebrow. "One hand, okay?" "Go ahead," the instructor said slowly. Hayes reached, rotated his shoulder, and lifted it cleanly with one arm, palm up, then spun it once for good measure before lowering it again. A few cadets took an involuntary step back. "Varelian limit," the instructor said, not blinking. The 491-kilogram block hovered into place. Hayes cracked his neck, tilted his head, and lifted it overhead with both arms. Then he rotated his torso slowly, turning in place while holding the block like it was a stretching pole. "That enough rotation?" The instructor stared at the tablet in his hands. The biometric data showed stable oxygen saturation, no strain spikes, core temperature normal, no visible muscular tremors. A biomech couldn't have delivered a cleaner lift. Whispers spread across the floor. A Threxian muttered something about human musculature being denser than recorded. A Varelian whispered about outdated gravity adaptation models. Someone near the back asked if he was cyber-augmented. The instructor's voice dropped a note. "Increase gravity. Double it." The room groaned. Floor plates sank with a dull boom. Some cadets staggered. A Solarian dropped to a knee and held onto the railing. The Varelian tried to stand, then decided to sit again. Hayes straightened. "Oh, that feels right. Earth standard now?" The instructor's head tilted. "You've been operating under lower gravity this entire semester?" "I figured it was intentional," Hayes said. "Part of the training curve." A slow realization began to dawn in the others. The human had been completing the same physical drills, sparring rounds, and load runs they had with more weight per muscle fiber and more resistance on every movement. What they thought was parity had never even been equal. The instructor tapped a silent command. A block meant only for mechanized loading units rose from the floor. It weighed 1,200 kilograms. The assistant drone next to the console beeped an alert. "Warning. Bioload exceeds standard exocet tolerance. Manual lift strongly discouraged." Hayes stepped toward it. He rolled his shoulders, adjusted his stance, took a long, measured breath. Then he gripped the corners of the massive cube, locked his elbows, and drove upward. The platform hissed. The weight rose. And Hayes stood tall, unshaking, unstraining, just holding. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply looked straight ahead, his breathing even. The instructor stepped forward. "Why did you ask that question earlier?" he said. Hayes looked down. "Which one?" Their limit or mine? What did you mean? Hayes let out a small breath and slowly lowered the block to the floor. I wasn't talking about alien species, he said quietly. The instructor narrowed his eyes. Then what were you talking about? Hayes stood still, both hands open at his sides. I was thinking about my last deployment on Earth, about a man named Corporal Nathan Ramos. We were pinned down in a landslide zone. He took shrapnel to the chest. Lung collapsed. He was bleeding out and couldn't walk. The evac point was over 3 kilometers away. I didn't think. I just picked him up. He looked around the room. 3 clicks. Uphill. Debris falling. Radio blackout. I carried him the whole way. Silence. That's the heaviest thing I've ever lifted. He tapped the block beside him with his boot. This? It doesn't come close. The room didn't breathe. One of the Varelians touched its wrist pad and scanned Hayes again. The readings still made no sense. And yet, they did. Because for the first time, the cadets understood something they hadn't been trained for. Hayes hadn't trained to lift weights. Hayes had trained to lift people. The instructor stared at the numbers, then at the man who made them irrelevant. And he tapped one final command. Load the maximum. The chamber dimmed as the final mass block rose from the depths. No glow, no stabilization hum. This one didn't need flare. It was a matte gray slab of condensed alloy, triple cored, fused for mech pressure testing. A printed warning label still ran along one side. Do not engage without external frame support. The block had crushed the hydraulic limbs of a Mark IX exosuit last cycle. The cadet inside had shattered both femurs and spent 4 months in orthopedic traction. No one had ever lifted it. Not even the instructors. The floor recognized the load weight and triggered a station-wide alert. Maximum lift load engaged. Biohazard risk, high. Support drones moved automatically into standby. Emergency foam ports primed. The lights over the chamber shifted to hazard red. Protocol demanded an instructor override before continuing. The instructor didn't stop it. Hayes stepped forward as though it were just another rep. He wasn't casual. His breathing had changed slower now, measured but not labored. He approached the block the same way he had approached every obstacle during the semester, not looking for challenge or glory, but for how it worked. 2 Threxians near the edge of the chamber had unconsciously shifted into protective stances, hands splayed slightly, a vestigial display posture reserved for predator defense. The Solarian twins moved to the side rail and held it tightly. A Virelian with a neural pressure band across his forehead whispered, "He's not biomechanical. I scanned him twice." The instructor's finger hovered near the kill switch, but he didn't press it. Hayes dropped into position. He didn't rush, his feet spaced shoulder-width apart. He adjusted his grip twice. One hand was still bandaged from a sparring injury during close quarters week. The room was silent except for the faint buzz of the overload monitors waiting for him to fail. He began the lift. The grav block resisted like a buried mountain. Sensors registered nearly 1,900 kilograms. The floor groaned. Hayes exhaled. Slowly, the block began to rise. 1 inch, then 2. The platform started to vibrate, not from the mass itself, but from the force being transferred through it. The alloy wasn't meant to feel this kind of biological pressure. It had been calibrated for machines. Cold, clean, predictable machines. Hayes was none of those things. His muscles engaged in coordinated recruitment, not maximal contraction, but efficient movement. He wasn't just hauling the weight, he was moving with it. Core engaged, breathing in rhythm, blood pressure climbing in safe but escalating patterns. Then came the crack. The backplate of the lift platform split diagonally, right beneath his heels. The chamber gasped. Even the instructor flinched. Hayes held the block. Upright. Steady. The platform buckled further. A stabilization beam snapped from its magnetic anchor with a sound like metal screaming. Still, Hayes stood. A warning beacon flashed at the top of the chamber. Structural failure imminent. Finally, the instructor hit the emergency kill switch. Hayes set the block down with deliberate care. The room stayed silent. Not even the machines could keep up. Tech support arrived from the upper catwalks, rushing to assess damage. One engineer gaped at the readout and whispered, This is over the biological red line. He should have torn his spine out. But he hadn't. Hayes walked backward off the platform and rolled out his shoulders. His breathing was elevated but under control. No facial cyanosis, no muscular tremors. Heart rate in the mid-130 seconds. That was conditioning, not luck. The instructor walked to the center of the room, staring at the data streaming from the busted platform. "Full biometric sweep," he ordered. The drones scanned Hayes in real time, projecting vitals onto the wall. Muscle integrity, intact. Joint strain, within acceptable variance. Oxygen saturation, 97%. Lactic threshold, not breached. Cardiac rhythm, stable. No tendon micro-tearing. No vertebral compression. One of the drones froze mid-scan. Its logic stack crashed. Another drone blinked red. Error. No strain pattern available. "What does that mean?" asked a Luravan cadet from the side. "It means," the instructor said slowly, "he hasn't hit his limit yet." Whispers spread again, but they sounded different now. Less skeptical. More reverent. "He didn't strain?" the Solarian twins echoed. "Not significantly. But the machine cracked first," the Threxian said. The instructor didn't look away from Hayes. Exactly. The humans in the system, those few who had enrolled in the interplanetary cadet program, were known to be sturdy, survivors of a high-pressure, high-oxygen, high-variable climate world. But nothing in the existing xenobiological texts accounted for this. Hayes wasn't superior. He was adapted. He hadn't moved like someone showing off. He hadn't sought dominance. He had responded to a command with a question and then with action. No drama, no flexing, only execution. The instructor finally broke the silence again. "Why didn't you stop?" Hayes raised an eyebrow. "You didn't say stop. You said, lift what you can. Why keep going after the equipment started breaking?" He looked down at his still bandaged hand, flexed it once, and said quietly, "Because sometimes things are breaking around you, and you don't get to stop. Not until the weight's off your back. Not until the person you're carrying can breathe again." Several cadets shifted uncomfortably. The Varelian adjusted his neural band and stared at the floor. The instructor stepped forward again. "Earlier, you said the heaviest thing you ever lifted was another soldier." Hayes nodded. The instructor tapped his pad. "That weight today exceeded him, easily." Hayes looked up, and for the first time, something else passed behind his expression, something quieter, older. "Yeah, this was heavier." "Then why didn't you stop?" Hayes didn't answer immediately. He sat on the edge of the platform, elbows resting on his knees. The cracked floor hissed faintly under the strain. He finally said, "Because it's not about the number. When Ramos got hit, I didn't know how much he weighed. I didn't care. I didn't have a gauge or a lift sensor. Just adrenaline and time running out. When someone's life is on your back, the question isn't whether you can carry them. It's whether you'll let yourself fail if they can't walk." The silence that followed wasn't stunned this time. It was understanding. A Solarian cadet stepped forward hesitantly. "You don't train for lifts?" "Not like this." "Then what do you train for?" Hayes gave a tired smile. Stairs, mud, blood loss, screaming, carrying someone when every step gets you 1 second closer to a medic or 1 second closer to watching them die. One of the Threxians muttered something unintelligible and sat down on the floor. The instructor watched as the entire room began to re-evaluate the test they had just taken. The lifting was never the point. And Hayes hadn't been proving anything. He had been reliving something. A memory. A responsibility. A moment every human soldier is taught to survive, not for glory, but for each other. Then a soft tone from the chamber wall. The med system chimed. "Scan complete. No injuries detected. Load recorded. 1,897 kilograms. Status: biological limit not found." The instructor added a note beside it. "Cadet Daniel Hayes. Species: Homo sapiens. Strength rating: unmeasurable. Notes: testing terminated due to equipment failure. Cadet showed no signs of exertion consistent with load class." Hayes stood up again. A faint sheen of sweat glistened at his temple now, finally. But no wobble, no limp. One of the techs approached him with a portable scanner, and gestured awkwardly. I just, can I double-check something? Sure, Hayes said. The tech waved the device around his thoracic spine, then his shoulder girdle. He blinked. There's no strain. Your rotator cuffs are stable. You didn't even hyperextend. Hayes shrugged. I've been through worse. He didn't elaborate. But now the room wanted him to. The instructor didn't smile, but there was a hint of curiosity edging towards something deeper: respect, maybe. Or recognition. He closed his tablet, turned to the class, and spoke loud enough for every species to hear him clearly. Strength isn't about the numbers on the wall. The cadets stood straighter. He pointed to the broken platform. That was designed for machines. It failed before he did, and that tells you what you need to know about humans. They weren't built for lifting weights, they were built for lifting each other. The alien stared at Hayes. He looked uncomfortable with the attention, but not surprised by it. He picked up his half-finished bottle of water, took a sip, and finally said, "You told us to lift what we can." He looked at the cracked floor and the blinking system alerts. I lifted what mattered. The graviton strength chamber was evacuated for structural review within 10 minutes. Emergency technicians filed in with reinforced jack stands and acoustic hammers, scanning the cracked platform while whispering to each other in the tight, nervous way people do when reality hasn't caught up to the numbers they just read. A security barrier sealed off the lift area, but no one had to be told to stay back. No one wanted to stand where the machine broke first. Cadets gathered in pockets along the walls, eyes darting from the shattered paneling to Hayes, who sat now on a bench near the exit door. His posture was slumped, forearms resting on his thighs, water bottle loose in one hand. For the first time, he looked tired. Not broken, not injured, just tired in the quiet way soldiers often were after the action ended and the adrenaline stopped being useful. A Virelian med specialist arrived from the infirmary wing, her multiple sensor lenses dilating as she moved toward him. "Cadet Hayes," she said with mechanical calm, "we require a full scan, high-yield, diagnostic, neural, and musculoskeletal." He glanced up. "Just make sure the bench holds." The technician hesitated. Why would... The bench groaned beneath him as he shifted. Several cadets flinched. The scan module folded out from her shoulder harness and hovered over his head, emitting a soft, oscillating whir. Scanning beams passed over him, standard routine after high-load trauma exposure. Except this time, the machine beeped mid-process. Then again. Then froze. The scan display began to flicker, jumping through spectrographic ranges it wasn't programmed to use. "System error," the tech said, confused. "Attempting reset." She tried again. "Signal return inconsistent. Muscular strain levels not found. Neural conductivity within high training tolerance. No inflammation markers. No acute stress indicators. Manual override required." "What's wrong with it?" a Threxian cadet asked. The med tech frowned. "It can't find what it's designed to detect." He didn't strain himself. "Not even micro tears?" asked one of the Solarian twins. The scanner buzzed again. "No, none detected." One of the observing instructors stepped closer, arms crossed. "That model's military grade. We use it for battlefield triage." "It's not broken," she said. "It's just confused." Hayes exhaled through his nose and leaned back. "You know it's weird when even the machine thinks you're lying." That got a few nervous chuckles. Nervous because the facts didn't align. "May I check your wrists?" the medtech asked. "Sure." She slid a probe under his sleeve and examined the tendons, flexing the joint lightly. No damage. Not even soft tissue bruising. This was bandaged before the lift? "Yeah, got it from a fall drill last week." "What about your back?" Hayes unzipped the upper part of his uniform and turned, letting her scan his spinal line. She paused. "You've had compression fractures." "Old ones." She tapped the data panel again. 2 thoracic vertebrae, healed naturally. "They said I didn't need surgery if I stayed mobile. That was 3 years ago." She nodded slowly. "You've got the spinal alignment of a war veteran twice your age." A Solarian murmured behind her. "What kind of environment do humans train in?" Hayes reached for his shirt and zipped it back up. "The kind that doesn't ask for permission first." The chamber's overhead lights flickered as diagnostics continued in the background. The emergency lift area had been quarantined. 3 engineers argued quietly over whose fault it was that a human cadet had exceeded the red line load protocol. But Hayes was no longer looking at the broken machine. He was watching the other cadets. They weren't gawking now. Not really. They were calculating, wondering, comparing data that didn't fit in their current frame of understanding. A Virelian with soft gray skin and faint glow lines around its temples walked forward. "You said you carried your squad mate," it began, "through hostile terrain?" Hayes nodded. "Why didn't you leave him when your lungs were failing?" "Because he was still breathing." "But the probability of survival?" "Doesn't matter. But if both of you died, then we died together." The Virelian blinked, struggling to process the reasoning. "You risked your own survival for a reduced chance of his." Hayes sat forward. "Yeah, and if it had been me on the ground, Ramos would have done the same." "You are trained to value group survival over individual?" "No, we're trained to value each other. That's not the same thing." The Virelian didn't respond. Neither did anyone else. An instructor finally broke the silence, stepping forward with an updated scan tablet in his hands. "Hayes." "Sir?" "You've broken every comparative metric for strength among first-cycle cadets. The only reason the system didn't mark it as impossible is because we saw it happen with our own eyes. But I want to be very clear here." Hayes stood. "Understood. This isn't just a display of force, it's something else. You didn't perform like an enhanced athlete, you performed like a trauma patient in an emergency response loop." Hayes tilted his head. "Is that a problem?" The instructor paused. "No. But it makes us think about what this chamber is really designed to measure." Behind them, engineers sealed the broken floor plate under a polyalloy sheath. 2 drones lowered into diagnostic hibernation. The emergency siren light finally clicked off with a hollow clack. "Until now," the instructor continued, "we assumed limits were biological, that every species had a ceiling. But I think we've been asking the wrong question." He looked directly at Hayes. "You weren't built to lift loads, you were built to not leave them behind. That's what this test measured." A few cadets nodded slowly. The instructor turned to the rest of the group. "We talk about combat readiness, reaction speed, kinetic power. But none of that prepares you to carry someone through fire when you're out of meds and time. Humans train that by default. Because for them, it's not a scenario, it's history." Hayes didn't speak. The Virelian finally stepped forward again. "But if you had failed to lift him, what would have happened?" "I would have crawled until I couldn't, and then dragged him until something stopped us." "Even if it broke you?" Hayes looked down at his hand, flexed it once. "Especially if it did." And that was the moment the alien cadets stopped comparing his strength to their own. They began comparing their philosophies. Because it wasn't that Hayes was stronger. It was that he was willing in a way that was structurally foreign to them. A Solarian stepped forward and asked, with something that almost sounded like humility, "Would you teach us that?" Hayes blinked. "What?" "That mindset, that principle. It's not a lesson, it's a decision." The Threxian tilted its head. "But how do you train for it?" "You don't. You just decide, and then when the moment comes, you don't quit. Not for pain, not for weight, not even for fear." The instructor recorded everything silently. A few feet away, the med tech closed her scanner. "No anomalies, still recommend hydration and sleep. But he's stable. In fact," she trailed off, glancing again at her readings, "I think he's already recovering." "Human recovery curves tend to start as soon as the load is gone," the instructor said. Hayes looked up. "That's true." "Why?" He gave a weak smile. "Because we don't know when we'll have to carry again." The repairs to the graviton strength chamber took the better part of a day. Cadets were rerouted to alternate training modules while a maintenance team replaced the cracked plates and recalibrated the floor's resonance dampeners. The engineer, who had originally signed off on the block's tolerance rating, now walked with a permanent slump in his shoulders, avoiding eye contact with instructors. Meanwhile, Hayes was given a standard post-event rest order and assigned to the recovery bay, though the term recovery was more procedural than medical. He lay back on a diagnostic couch, hooked to vitals out of protocol, reading a paperback novel with the calm of someone who had just filed taxes. By midday, word had spread well beyond the chamber. Instructors from other divisions stopped him in the corridor with polite but pointed questions about muscle load distribution and spinal conditioning. A group of Threxian engineering students requested an interview to better understand organic lift algorithms, a term Hayes had never heard before and never wanted to again. He declined. But the biggest change came in the schedule for the next day's cross-species tactical drill. Human cadets, only 3 on base this cycle, were now being rotated in as team leads. That had never happened before. At 0700 the following morning, a new schedule was posted outside the strength chamber. Hayes's name was listed again, not for another lift test, this time for a lecture. He stared at the listing for a long minute, then walked inside. The chamber had been repaired and sterilized. No damage remained. The shattered lift plate had been replaced with a black carbon steel slab, stronger than the original. A few cadets stood near the far wall, waiting silently. By 0705, the room was full. Not just his own unit. Upper cycle cadets, medical personnel, off-duty instructors, a handful of mech techs, even the quiet Varelian logistics officer, who usually worked in the orbital tower, had come down to listen. Hayes stood by the edge of the platform. He had nothing in his hands, no datapad, no prepared notes, just a quiet awareness of how loud a room could be without making a sound. The instructor from the day before stood to his side but didn't speak. Hayes stepped forward. "You all saw what happened," he began. No response, just attention. "I didn't come here to impress anyone. I didn't know the numbers. I wasn't trying to prove something." He paused. "I just didn't like how the question was worded." The room stirred slightly. "Lift what you can." It sounds simple, but I've heard that before. Not in tests, not in gyms, in the field, in chaos. When someone's dying, when you've got 30 seconds to move, or someone stops breathing. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. In that moment, you don't lift what you want. You lift what you have to. What's in front of you. What's screaming for help. What can't move on its own. You lift what matters. Several cadets shifted uncomfortably. You want to know the training? It's stairs in bad weather, with a full pack and someone heavier than you over your shoulder. It's pushing through when your lungs are empty, because you know theirs are worse. It's collapsing afterward, not before. And it's not done for glory. It's done because someone else needs your legs when theirs stop working. He turned slightly, facing the far side of the room. Strength isn't about the load you choose. It's about the weight you refuse to leave behind. He stepped off the platform. That was it. No applause, no questions, just the weight of something that didn't need repeating. But the impact wasn't in the words. It was in what came next. For the rest of the week, training behavior changed. During morning runs, alien cadets began pacing themselves to help slower partners finish. During low-grav mobility drills, Solarian twins were seen hauling a Threxian who had twisted his ankle instead of waiting for a hover stretcher. One Varelian began designing a telekinetic sling specifically calibrated for unconscious bodies under fire. No one said this was because of Hayes, but everyone knew it was. On the 4th day after the event, Hayes returned to the chamber during off hours. The lift platform was cold under his palms. He didn't attempt another block. He wasn't there to lift anything. He sat. The instructor found him like that 20 minutes later, arms on his knees, eyes on the floor. "You know we had to recalibrate everything after you." Hayes nodded. "We're rewriting part of the curriculum, not just for strength training." Hayes said nothing. "We used to assume that every cadet had a breaking point. Now we think we've been measuring it wrong." Still nothing. The instructor walked over and sat beside him. The silence was steady, not awkward. "You told me the weight you lifted wasn't the heaviest thing." "Wasn't," Hayes confirmed quietly. The instructor nodded. "I believe you." Hayes looked at him then. "Sir, I'm not a hero." "No," the instructor said. "You're something harder." There was another pause. Then, "You're a human trained not to quit when it hurts." Hayes let out a short breath through his nose. "It's not heroism to carry someone out of a hellhole," he said. "It's just not being the one who left them behind. And that's the lesson." Hayes finally stood. It shouldn't have taken a cracked lift platform to make that point. The instructor smiled faintly. Sometimes it does. On the wall behind them, the Academy's performance archive had been updated. A new silhouette stood tall on the strength record screen. It wasn't named. It didn't have a number. Just the Academy ID, Homo sapiens, limit, undefined. A small note blinked beneath it. Human limits are situational. As Hayes left the chamber, a new group of cadets filed in for their turn. This time, the instructor didn't begin with weights. He began with a question. What's the heaviest thing you've ever carried? The answers were quieter than before, and more honest. It rained on graduation day, not the chemical mist of orbital coolant or the brackish storm fronts of Varelian moon's real rain. Cold, clean, and inconvenient. The kind of Earth-style storm that made the walls hum and the courtyard puddle. It leaked through the seams of the canopy over the parade square and soaked the edge of every cadet's polished boots. No one moved. Cadets stood in formation, tails twitching, armor plating, fogging, uniforms heavy with wet. The Academy had insisted on holding the ceremony outdoors, some long-standing tradition about discipline under duress. The humans had nodded at that. The aliens, less so. Daniel Hayes stood at the end of the second row, shoulders relaxed under the stiff cut of the Academy dress uniform. The silver insignia on his chest looked newly polished, but the fabric of his sleeves was still faintly stained where the bandage had been during the chamber incident. He didn't try to hide it, he didn't stand out, but he didn't shrink either. The commandant, a towering Ulrex with a voice like falling boulders, gave the closing speech. It was the usual fare: courage, cooperation, sacrifice. For many cadets, it was their first and only graduation. Others would transfer into specialized corps. A few were already assigned to forward units on the edge of disputed systems. When the final names were called and the flags furled, there was no cheering, just a shared exhale, like everyone had been holding a breath for the entire year and only now remembered it could be let go. Cadets began dispersing, speaking quietly in clusters or walking alone toward the transport dock. A few families waited at the periphery, some behind screens, others in atmospheric suits. No one rushed. Hayes stayed back, near the side corridor leading to the upper mechanical wing. The platform where he'd lifted the unliftable had been replaced again, this time with reinforced beams and a new pressure distribution matrix. No one had used it yet. He wasn't planning to. He watched the rain bead along the top of a new plaque mounted near the chamber entrance. It bore no image, no crest, just a line etched deep enough to cast a shadow. Strength is not the load. It's the reason you lift. There was movement behind him. The instructor stepped up beside him, wearing the same uniform he always did. No rank embellishments, just the plain gray of an active training officer. The rain had caught him too. Water ran in small rivulets off the back of his collar. "I thought you'd be gone by now," he said. "Waiting for clearance," Hayes replied. "You're not taking leave?" Hayes shook his head. "Got a field post near Calyx Belt, medical support convoy, not front line, but close enough." The instructor looked at the plaque. "You'll see combat again." Hayes didn't answer right away. "I don't think we ever stop seeing it." They stood in silence for a moment. Then the instructor asked, "Do you think any of this changed them?" Hayes glanced toward the cadets dispersing in the distance. The Threxian, who used to race him in morning runs, was now walking in step with a Solarian, carrying both packs like it was second nature. One of the Varelians paused to help an Andarine adjust a load harness. The culture had shifted, subtly, permanently. "Yeah," Hayes said. "I think it did." The instructor exhaled slowly. "We used to teach that strength was a statistic, that it was something you trained into a chart." "I know," Hayes said. "You taught me that my first week. You taught us something back." Hayes didn't turn toward him, but his voice was quieter now. "I never wanted to be the lesson." "You weren't." The instructor looked at him then. Really looked. "You were the reminder." They stood in the doorway of the chamber until the last of the cadets cleared the square and the rain began to taper. The clouds remained, low and bruised, but the water no longer fell in sheets. Just a steady rhythm, like breath. "You know," the instructor said, "we've rewritten the evaluation protocols." Hayes raised an eyebrow. "No more static lift tests," the instructor continued. No more weight charts. It's all scenario-based now. Carriage under stress, movement with burden, shared load operations. Hayes gave a faint nod. Good. And we added one more line to the core competencies. He pulled a folded slip of paper from his coat and handed it over. Hayes unfolded it. Final addendum. Interspecies survival standard. Candidate must demonstrate capacity to be carried, and willingness to carry others. Hayes folded it again and tucked it into his pocket. Took you long enough? The instructor smiled. We had to measure it first. Hayes glanced once more at the plaque. Then he stepped out into the rain. No ceremony, no music, no applause. Just the quiet departure of someone who had already done what needed to be done and didn't wait for someone else to give it meaning. He walked toward the dock. His bag was light, his shoulders were not. Behind him, the chamber dimmed as it entered standby. The new sensor array blinked once, recalibrated, and saved a baseline. It would wait for the next cadet. It would wait for the one who understood. You lift what you can. And what you can is whatever needs lifting.